throughout my life, I carry with me a very small bookshelf with just a few books. And sometimes I'm lucky enough to be able to add to that small collection of books that, in addition to speaking to the things in our humanity that are universal, they also have something to say that is very particular, very specific to my own unique religious upbringing and the unique religious, intellectual, cultural context in which I was raised. These are books, these are poems that have something to say about some of the voices and some of the rhythms that have echoed in my head and continue to echo in my head because those were the voices and the rhythms in which I was raised. It was the air that I breathed. The book Ninveh is a small book of poetry by Rabbi Dr. Zohar Atkins, and it is very much on that shelf. I'll just read some of the book's description. Quote, Zohar Atkins' poems offer humor and hospitality alongside deep learning and enigmatic mystical theophany. The division between secular and religious is blurred. The two coexist in a generous exchange. The Bible is near at hand, but rendered unfamiliar in the combination of anachronism with classical allusion. Cain and Abel appear as business executives. Ishmael is a Palestinian dying in an Israeli hospital. Rachel and Leah are the projected identities of a demented Jacob, and God is a perfectionist who procrastinates by binge-watching TV. End of quote. Among other things, Rabbi Zohar Atkins holds a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar, and he is the author of a book titled An Ethical and Theological Appropriation of Heidegger's Critique of Modernity. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Rabbi Dr. Zohar Atkins. Great. So I'm here with Rabbi Dr. Zohar Atkins. This is such a special treat. Thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
I want to get to some poetry readings. That's like one of my things I'm really looking forward to. But sort of a little bit starting maybe adjacent to your poetry. I just wanted to ask the question, what is Midrash to you?
I would say it's identification with the text, personalization of the text, taking a story and reworking it. It's Midrash is folklore, it's fan fiction, it's commentary. I mean, classically, I think Midrash is, let's say, creative misreading in a way, reading against the grain of the text as opposed to, let's say, pshat, which would be reading the text in its context. But I don't really believe in that distinction because I think that Midrash is like the truth of fiction. It exaggerates things, but as a way of getting closer to them than pshat can. That makes sense. It's like the emotional truth of the story, even if.
Would you say you engage in that?
Sometimes I write midrashim as a way of making the Torah personal. But I guess, yeah, I would distinguish between maybe two kinds of midrash. One is narrow midrash, which I do, like you see in poems like Cain and Abel, or Descent, where I overtly take a biblical story and rework it. And then there's midrash in like the broader sense, which is personifying God or personifying something that is not directly rooted in the text, but is just more a way of making something abstract relevant. Right. So like the angels telling God not to create the world, for instance, it doesn't have to be based in any of written Torah, but we still call it midrash. It's probably more accurate to call it Agadah, story.
Can you give an example to me or to anyone watching of a midrash from the Talmud or any episode from the Talmud that you think maybe has some resonance today or is just thought provoking or something?
I mean, the somewhat cliched, but one of my favorite midrashim is the one where Abraham. It's from Bereshit Rabbah, where Abraham is wandering around and finds Bira Deleket, the illuminated castle or the castle on fire, and asks, "Is there an owner? Is there a superintendent here?" And God answers, or the master answers from the flames, "I am the master of the castle."
Mm-hmm.
So it's great on two levels. One, because it answers a mystery on the pshat level, which is, how did Abraham come to be Abraham? Like, we don't know much about his backstory. We just get Lech Lecha. It's like, well, did Abraham have to do something first to merit that call? And then it does something theologically really interesting, and I would say modern in a way, which is place the human being as the protagonist and God as, in some sense, the partner, but in an even deeper sense, is the vulnerable party who needs human rescue. So it anticipates kind of post-Holocaust theology.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So one of my favorite poems in your book, Ninveh, is Tosefta. And that's an example, I think, of a poem which like draws very heavily from that particular genre. Could we do a reading, of Tosefta? Is that a possibility?
You want me to read the poem? Or
yeah, would that be okay?
You want to interpret it? Sure, it's long. I don't mind.
It's up to you. I mean, I'm open for anything. If you want to, I'm for the whole thing. But whatever you wanted. If you wanted to not do the whole thing,
I'll do it. No, I'll do it.
Okay, awesome.
Tosefta. So for the listeners, Tosefta is Tannaitic literature that's excluded from the Mishnah. Tosefta, like, it means the added stuff or the extraneous stuff. I'll leave it at that, I guess. But it's paradoxically, it's that which doesn't make the canon, which is left out. But of course, now we read it as canonical or pseudo-canonical, so it's not exactly left out. Rav Kahana told the story that Rav Chisda said, "In all my days, I was considered a master of planting and collecting. Yet when I went out to trim the vineyards, I cut too close to the vine. Now people will say, it would be better if I hadn't trimmed at all." To which Abaye said, "The branches shall return, the leaves shall return, and the fruit shall return. The only thing you have shorn is yourself." Said Rav Chisda, "But what harvest can there be in the meantime?" Said Abaye, "If one goes out as a harvester, one shall return a harvester." Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak gave a different account. He said Rav Chisda was concerned about an imperfection around his genitals he had revealed while grooming himself. Rav Chisda said, "The shears that should have been my exaltation have become my demise. What will my wife say when she sees me like this?" Abaye sought to console him. "First, your imperfection will soon be covered. Second, it is not an imperfection. And third, if it is an imperfection, your wife will not see it as such." Rav Papa recounted it differently. Rav Chisda was depressed because all the days of his life he had been meticulous in his prayers. Yet when it came time for him to lead Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, he forgot all of the words except for the opening blessing. He said to himself, "On what will my blessing carry?" Abaye said, "On your silence." Rav Chisda objected that one cannot praise in silence. Abaye said, "First, your silence shall soon turn to song. Second, it already is a kind of song. And third, even if you never sing again, your students shall respond Amen all the same." Rav Chisda retorted, "I'm not worried about my students, but about the one who speaks and worlds come to presence." Said Abaye, "If one approaches with the hope that he will listen, he will listen."
Wow. Thank you so much. Yeah, for doing that reading. I mean, just for me, when I read this, oh man, like the polyphony of voices and the polyphony of perspectives. It just feels like a house of mirrors in a kind of way. And part of the power of this for me is that, I mean, I was raised, I grew up with this voice, this genre, as being such an important text in my life. You know, I studied it for 2 years in yeshiva, the Talmud specifically, which is like written in this style, and yeah, it's just and it gives sort of an appreciation, I think, maybe for me in the poem because it's such a familiar kind of voice, but also it like casts a light back on those texts in a way for me as well, because it reveals just as much, I think, about some of the complexity that is going on in those contradictory perspectives, alternative versions, alternative stories. There's like a playfulness to it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I take a lot of inspiration from the Talmudic polyphony, and also from, if you're familiar with him, Edmond Jabez. He's an Egyptian-born, French-speaking, French-writing Jew who wrote a book called The Book of Questions, which is filled with pseudo-rabbinic dialogues. And he, I think, really opened this form of putting aphorisms in the mouth of rabbis. Many of his rabbis had fake names. They're not actually Talmudic characters. But sort of, what does it do to the meaning of a sentence when you know something about the speaker or don't know much, but the name has a power? You know what I mean? Like Rav Chisda. It's like Rabbi Chesed. Does it matter? Because this is one of the things I think about when I read Talmud, is how much does it matter who's saying the thing? Are these just caricatures, placeholders for free-floating sentences, or is there like a meta drama going on in the arguments where these sentences are expressing something of personality differences or temperament differences?
Yeah, that's amazing. So maybe I'll add some more questions, and then maybe after some questions we'll go back to and do another reading, the different poem, if that's okay. You hold a doctorate in philosophy, is that right? Theology?
I have, theology technically, yeah.
Okay.
A DPhil, but Doctor of Philosophy and Theology.
Right, got it. So my question is, and I know you've written about Heidegger, is that right?
I have.
My question is that intention with your poetry?
Before I answer that, just can you spell what you think the tension might be?
Sure.
What's your Hava Amina?
yeah, for sure. So there's something very imprecise, perhaps, or relativistic about art and poetry. There seems to be a trafficking in something which is not really expressible, or something which seems it might be in tension with philosophy, which is maybe puts a premium on precision and a kind of philosophical clarity.
Yeah. The answer is yes, there's a tension, and no, there's a tension. I experience a fruitful tension that is at times a synthesis. There's a lot to say on the topic. I mean, Heidegger himself, I think, is a middle ground or a hybrid figure between art and philosophy. So he's coming to poetry from the philosophical side. I think it's also possible to come to philosophy from the poetic side. I would hold up Wallace Stevens as a poet first, but whose poetry is interested in concepts. So maybe the medium of philosophy tends to be concepts. The medium of poetry tends to be more music, right? You're not, if in a philosophy a concept happens to sound good, that's irrelevant. Whereas in the arts, sounding good and the emotional experience you get from the material quality of the work matters as much as the sense, what is being, the message that's being communicated. So there is that tension, but Heidegger describes the task that he says, the thinker says what is, the poet names what is holy. Very cryptic line.
Wow.
The thinker is engaged with questions of ontology, with questions of being and meaning. The poet is in relationship, existential relationship with those same things. It's so maybe it's the philosopher tends to be more impersonal and objective, the poet more personal, but there are some philosophers who would argue against taking an impersonal approach and try and believe that philosophy should be personalized, and that's existentialism. So I that's a very kind of removed answer. And then on the personal level, I'm like the man in the Talmud who's married to two wives. One is Agadah and one is Halakha. And he says, when he moves towards the one plucks out his black hairs and the other plucks out his gray hairs.
You define Halakha and Agadah?
I don't know, maybe it's a chauvinistic image, but I just love the idea of like a person's hair getting plucked out. And so that's kind of how I relate to it, is when I'm doing poetry, philosophy tugs at me. And when I do philosophy, poetry tugs at me. Neither one is enough.
Can you just define? Yeah. So like the mapping of halakha and agadah. So in halakha would be like legalistic.
I think that halakha, in the way that I was just alluding, corresponds to philosophy in the sense of category.
Right.
And agadah is like the moral sense, the lived experience sense, which is oftentimes category transgressing and much messier.
Can you recommend a reading which maybe is sort of relevant or maybe not relevant to this kind of tension of one of your poems specifically?
Yeah, I would say, this one is definitely a more difficult poem. So for people who are just familiarizing themselves with my work, it may not be the best introduction, but well, you know what? I'll do a different one. I was gonna say fake Judaism, because I think it's about the interrelationship between religion and philosophy. But I'll do a much shorter one called Hermeneutics. It's on page 43 in the book. Hermeneutics comes from Greek. Hermeneuin just means to interpret. Hermeneutics is the discipline dealing with the art or the science of interpretation. What assumptions do you bring to a text, and should those be your assumptions? So it's a very short poem. It's just called Hermeneutics. I ask the giant if he wants my seat. Either he doesn't hear me or he doesn't want to.
So, yeah. Can you?
Right. It's called hermeneutics, which is a philosophical term, yet it's a poem about hermeneutics. So if you just wanted to make a declarative statement about interpretation, you wouldn't do that. Right? This is trying to dramatize the experience of interpretation rather than simply describe interpretation from the balcony view.
Yeah.
I guess it's more circular, more meta.
It reminds me a little bit of another poem which I absolutely love from this book, Radish.
Oh yeah, I love that one.
I love it.
Sure. Should we do that one?
I love it, if you don't mind. Yeah, you can always push back on me, but as long as you're obliging, I'll keep asking.
Radish. How can I begin my tale when I am still in it? I pulled a radish from the ground and found the ground more deep than what my eyes had opened. Beneath the spot, another sapling formed, so that the vanity of my urgency grew in measure with my obstinacy. Soon I was surrounded by radishes so enormous I regretted being born. I stopped to write this poem, hoping it would help, but even here, before I end, is another radish.
Yeah, I love it. So just to give you sort of like the kind of effect it has on me, and I don't know if this is inappropriate, if like maybe I shouldn't comment on the poem because it should just stand for itself in a way, but I can't help myself. So this is just my own sort of impression. But like for me, I get like the sense of like the futility and the necessity of like the poetry. Like I stopped to write the poem hoping it would help, and then this sort of like surreal, infinite regress image is like this like unstoppable Sisyphean kind of like hallucinogenic vision of like reality. You know, this like nonstop radishes.
Yeah,
Um,
I
yeah.
think that's astute. I mean, right. I'm fascinated by performative contradiction.
Hmm.
And again, it's much more interesting to do a performative contradiction than to write about it. So one of the limits of philosophy is that it doesn't get its hands dirty. It doesn't acknowledge maybe that the hands are already dirty. Whereas I think when you write poetry, when you write a poem about what is the use of poetry, for me, it feels more meaningful than a philosopher asking what is the use of philosophy.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Really. Go
yeah,
ahead.
because I mean, the fact that you're writing a poem about poetry not helping, but you're
Hmm.
doing it anyways, it creates an effect of an unreliable narrative or an unconscious that the poet doesn't necessarily know best. The poem knows best.
Yeah. Okay. Um, there's one poem which I feel like I would love to also make sure we get in here because
Okay.
I love it. It resonates sort of like on a personal level, I guess, in a weird way. And it taps into an element of your poetry which I feel like we haven't touched on yet, which is that there's a real strong sense of the modern in your poetry. In the sense like you don't live and you're not writing from the Middle Ages or something, you know, like you're writing in the modern world. And um, so I would love if you don't mind um, the Song of Myself
Sure, sure,
because I am also a Walt Whitman fan, and um, so let's see here.
sure. Page 28 for the
Yeah.
readers. This is it's Song of Myself Apocryphal,
Hmm. Yeah.
which apocryphal just means it's like the apocryphal parts of the Bible,
Hmm.
the things that got left out. I guess that's often a theme, sort of the forgery or the fraudulence of antiquity, like finding something that should have been there but wasn't. Something. I am my own listserv, advertising job and fellowship opportunities for myself, by myself, to myself. I sing of unpaid internships to my soul, O soul, and of passing controversies on which to take sides is to take the side of the self. I repost myself and forward myself, respond to myself with emojis, for I am the screen and its anticipation, the pleasure of being liked and of commanding myself to like others. For all pages are contained in my potential for sharing, scrolling, even viewing incognito. I sign in on myself and log out of myself, and yet remain more than my usernames and forgotten passwords. For I am the great web itself, and every parody known to it is known to me, and every troll who devastates its comment section is of myself. I am celebrity culture and conspiracy theory culture, the metastasis of meaning that nurtures both political gossip and culture wars, food blogs, parenting blogs, and cat videos. What you shall click, I shall click. And where you shall cut and paste, I shall be cut and paste. Do I make myself redundant? Very well then, I make myself redundant. I am a paywall. disambiguation. I contain metadata.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely love that poem. Because I think one of the things poetry can do is it can make like the invisible visible in a kind of way, maybe. And so for me personally, just like my own personal subjective experience of like reading this poem is like thinking about the way that myself is transformed because of like the modern, communication age. Just it's something that's just obviously it's like infinitely ubiquitous, but also invisible in a way. And so I don't know. I find it. Yeah, I find it an amazing experience. I love that poem. So maybe I'll just pose the question to you. Like, when did you get your start? Like, what inspires you to write? However you want to take the question.
I think when I was much younger, like in high school, I simply liked the sound of words.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote poetry that was not shaped by a persona, but was just seeing how different sounds can form from unexpected word combinations, maybe more like abstract expressionism. And then I think in graduate school, poetry became more of an escape mechanism from writing a dissertation, which is that there's a lot more freedom in being able to break a line wherever you want, or say something that is more ambiguous, that I didn't have when I was writing prose, specifically academic prose, which is the most anti-artistic kind of writing you can do.
Are you scared when you publish, when you write and you share your poetry? Does it scare you? Did it ever scare you or no?
Why would I be scared?
Well, fear of failure, fear of criticism, fear of misunderstanding. I don't know.
I don't care if my poems are understood.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding is not the goal. My goal is to say something singular in the hopes that that singularity will make somebody feel moved. If my goal was primarily educational, I wouldn't write poetry. But I think that it's harder to move. It's harder to say the unsayable in paragraph form as nonfiction. So I write poetry to say the unsayable, and if it doesn't land, then that's fine. So I'm not really afraid, and I also don't really know what failure means in the context of art, because it's a very personal experience for the reader. So if someone doesn't like my poetry, that's fine. Just as I read a lot of poems that I don't like, and that's also fine.
Amazing. Rabbi Dr. Zohar Atkins, I really appreciate you taking the time. This was really a pleasure, really a thrill.
Thanks for your care and interest on the God. Be well and stay poetic.
Will do. All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Cheers.